Hello, Archie Dunlop here with Talking Astrology with Archie on Friday, July the 4th, 2025. Happy birthday, America! It is indeed the United States' 249th birthday. And so inevitably, I want to have a look at the United States' horoscope with particular reference to its solar return and its Jupiter return, because we do have a situation, where the United States has got its Sun and Jupiter in Cancer, and the Sun and Jupiter are returning to where they were on July the 4th, 1776, and these returns happen very close together, and I think that in itself is significant. I also want to look at the fact that there is a conjunction between Venus and Uranus today. And I will be looking at a couple of people who have Venus-Uranus conjunctions in their charts, but I want to focus more on events, because we can associate particular types of events with this conjunction, and maybe that might say something about what we're going through at the moment, in the first few days of July 2025. But before I look at the United States' chart, before I go into detail about the Venus-Uranus conjunction, I want to consider the astrology and the I Ching for today, which is Friday, July the 4th, 2025. So here is the chart for today, set for noon in New York. By the way, don't forget to like and subscribe if appropriate. I've stuck USA there, just a reminder that it is July the 4th, and also Venus conjunct Uranus, the symbols for Venus conjunct Uranus, just to show that I will be talking about the Venus-Uranus conjunction. But let's start off by looking at today, and there's actually a fair amount of things going on. So the moon is in Scorpio, 3 degrees Scorpio at noon New York time on July the 4th. That's not great. Traditionally, in Western astrology, 3 degrees Scorpio is the absolute worst place that the moon can be. The 3 degrees Scorpio is the point of the moon's maximum fall. And this concept of minimum and maximum fall, maybe one gets that from Vedic astrology, the idea being that you could say that 3 degrees Taurus is the point of the moon's maximum exaltation, and 3 degrees Scorpio maximum fall. So as the moon moves between 3 degrees Taurus and 3 degrees Scorpio, its exaltational strength changes, and that is, I believe, one of the features of Shadbala, which is a way of evaluating the strengths of planets in Vedic astrology. But we're talking about Western astrology here, and with the moon at 3 degrees Scorpio, it's not a great day. If we look at that placement in isolation, things might be held back. There's strong emotions, but where are those emotions going? And they might go in the wrong places. Though, to mitigate that, the moon is making a trine to Jupiter, and it's starting to make a trine to the sun. How do we look at that moon trine Jupiter? Certainly a great Jupiter in Cancer, in its exaltation, with the moon trine Jupiter. Well, that Jupiter aspect is certainly going to strengthen the moon, so it's not all bad for the moon. But it's possible that Jupiter simply exaggerates the moon. And so a lot of those bad feelings bound up with the moon, not just in Scorpio, but fallen in Scorpio and close to the degree of maximum fall, then could be wound up with that. So what do you do? So if you're in the United States, the moon is at 3 degrees Scorpio at noon, and so after noon, the moon starts to move away from that point. Now, if you're in if you're in California, the moon is at 3 degrees Scorpio, around sort of 3 in the afternoon. So if you want to celebrate, if you insist on celebrating Independence Day, probably best to do it late in the day. Lunchtime gatherings, afternoon gatherings may not be great, even though the moon is making a trine to Jupiter. It's just that the fact that the moon is conjunct Scorpio. I mean, let me sort of moderate what I just said. Moon trine Scorpio can work really well. Sorry, moon trine Jupiter can work very well. It can. But I'm just concerned about that moon in Scorpio. Just the fact that it's at 3 degrees Scorpio. You kind of want the moon to get off that degree. But I think in most cases it will be fine. And of course, we just have to look at things from the worst possible perspective, as I like to do. And what could go wrong? And maybe we just have to say, well, moon trine Jupiter is great. So if you want things to be great, they can be great. So that's the lunar aspect to be thinking about, aside from the fact that we've got moon trine Jupiter and moon square Pluto. And that may be important given the fact that moon is at 3 degrees Scorpio, square Pluto, which is at 3 degrees Scorpio. So that could be quite intense. And again, when people are gathering, when people are enjoying themselves or trying to enjoy themselves, when it's square Pluto, that can be the moment where things flip. And so, there could be quite a lot of anger around in certain situations. But, I think most people in the United States, if they're celebrating Independence Day, even if they're celebrating Independence Day, at lunchtime rather than evening, it should be okay. But my general advice would be to sort of focus on the evening if you're in the Americas, rather than sort of earlier in the day. And there are other things going on. We have a conjunction between Venus and Uranus, and I will be talking about this conjunction in greater detail at the end of the video. But Venus conjunct Uranus is not an especially stable aspect, and it's taking place in the last degree of Taurus. In fact, Venus goes into Gemini, having just made that conjunction to Uranus. So things might be stirred up with that Venus conjunct Uranus, and it's not just about sudden meetings, changing relationships. It could be about rebellion and people being very clear about what they want and what they don't want. And additionally, we've got Neptune going stationary retrograde. So here on this chart at noon, July the 4th, 2025, you can see that Neptune does not have an R next to it, but at the end of the day, Neptune does station, and that might be something more collective. I'm not convinced that we're going to necessarily feel Neptune stationing today, and probably in my video for the weekend, I'll be looking at stationary Neptune in greater detail. So that is the picture for today from a US perspective. If we look at it from a Australian perspective, Australia, New Zealand, the moon is at 26 Libra. So you don't get that Scorpio until the end of the day. For most of the day, the moon is late Libra. It's making an opposition to Chiron, but apart from that, the moon isn't really going anywhere until this evening. So if you are in Australia or New Zealand, I suspect it's going to be a less active day than it's going to be in say the Americas. Though, with moon opposition Chiron, you might want to do something different. You might want to express your individuality, but it might be difficult, and you might try, but somehow you might feel that you're just not really applying to anything. And then there is the heliocentric view. Now, heliocentrically, there is an important configuration that we possibly need to be aware of. And I've kind of already suggested in the geocentric picture that maybe today is not necessarily especially stable because of that Venus conjunct Uranus, perhaps because the moon is in the Via Combusta. It's still in the Via Combusta, and so when the moon moves into Scorpio, it's the last half of a Via Combusta, and it tends to be the most difficult half of that part of the sky. And turning to the heliocentric view, there is an exact aspect between the Earth and Uranus. So the Earth is exactly 135 degrees from Uranus. So, okay, that aspect is not unusual. It will happen at a fairly regular. It will happen fairly regularly. Whether it's a conjunction, square, opposition, semi-square, sesquiquadrate. So every 6 weeks there'll be a hard aspect between the Earth and Uranus. But we have to look at the broader configuration. And Mars is starting to make a sesquiquadrate to Uranus. So we've also got a Sun-Mars square. So in fact, what we've got is we have got Uranus opposition did I say Sun-Mars? I meant Earth-Mars. We've got Uranus opposition the Earth-Mars midpoint. And so, when we're looking at heliocentric astrology, we should be looking at wider configurations. And I actually think that this link up between Earth, Mars, Uranus could be quite important. And it may be a day which isn't just tense, but things might happen, possibly on a global level. And it's not just today, it's as we move into the weekend, because, Mars is making the sesquiquadrate. It's not exact, but over the next couple of days, Mars will be making that sesquiquadrate to Uranus, and the weekend doesn't look entirely easy. But this is a heliocentric chart. It's more about the collective. It's not necessarily anything happening on an individual basis, but still. With Uranus on the Earth-Mars midpoint, opposition the Earth-Mars midpoint, take it easily. Don't take it easy. Don't take risks unless you have to. So now let's look at the 12 signs. So these are my forecasts for the 12 signs for today, which is Friday, July the 4th, 2025. Aries. Things are getting somewhat complicated. We just looked at the heliocentric view, and the Earth is still square Mars. Mars is, of course, your ruler. Mars is actually applying to a heliocentric sesquiquadrate with Uranus. You are perhaps aware that things aren't necessarily easy, that things are maybe more complicated than you'd like them to be. And as an Aries, you want things to be straightforward, and you want to be able to do what you want, not to have to run into any opposition, and you don't want to have to spend ages thinking about the situation, getting into some of your deeper emotions. But today that might be necessary. You should not assume that everything is straightforward. People might have made plans. They might have been apparently open and honest, but deep down that things just aren't that simple. And so, Aries, it's probably best if you just assume the worst. And when I say the worst, I'm not talking about disasters. I'm talking about just people behaving in a way that you hadn't expected, and people making things more complicated than they need to be. And we do have the moon moving into Scorpio, and Scorpio is a sign that's ruled by Mars, and of course Mars is your ruler. But it's the aspect of Mars which is it's intense, Scorpio, but it's also not necessarily easy, and so don't make assumptions, and assume that people are not necessarily being truthful. I mean, not because they're deliberately lying, they just might not know the facts, or they might not be able to predict their own behavior. Things can change. Someone might promise they're going to do something, and then something turns up, and it may not be an external event. They might just feel a particular way, and because they feel a particular way, they just have to drop everything. So that is something that you need to bear in mind. And on a positive note, I do think, Aries, if you take things seriously and you're very deliberate about everything, then I think that you will be able to start to sort of tune into your own power, and don't stray further than you have to from home ground. In fact, when you're on home ground, Aries, I do think that you're going to be at your strongest, and there is a trine aspect between Moon and Jupiter, Moon in Scorpio, Jupiter in Cancer, and that should help you. Again, provided you know what you're doing, provided you're absolutely familiar with the territory. Now, as far as relationships are concerned, Venus is changing sign. Venus has been in Taurus for a few weeks, and now it's moving into Gemini. So in spite of your own seriousness, perhaps it's your forced seriousness, forced by circumstance or forced by just the way you feel to be more serious than usual, not everyone is going to be so serious, and Venus moving into Gemini may indicate that someone close to you is experiencing a change probably for the better. Venus moving out of a fixed sign, moving into a mutable sign, and it's possible that, yes, someone is having a change of heart, is just becoming lighter, is becoming easier, but is perhaps becoming less predictable. Venus in Gemini, there's a lot of variety there, and Venus in Gemini can be about talking a lot but not always telling the truth. So if someone is being sort of light and saying a lot, and they've got something to say, they've got something to say about everything, enjoy their company, but don't hold them to their word. It's very difficult to hold Venus in Gemini to its word, because words flow freely, and you shouldn't take them too seriously. Taurus. Venus is your ruler, and Venus is doing things. Venus is making a conjunction to Uranus. Venus is moving out of Taurus and it's moving into Gemini. And so, Taurus, you might feel that you are undergoing something of a change, that the way things had been set up for the last few weeks is now starting to transition into something else. And perhaps, Taurus, you realize that the old way of doing things has gone as far as it can, and that actually it's now time for a change, and you may be looking for variety. And variety can be threatening. You thought you'd sorted everything out, you perhaps thought you'd set up a system for yourself, and you're beginning to now realize that that's just not good enough. Maybe it's become boring. I mean, Taurians can get bored, amazingly. Now, you might not think that is the case, that Taurians can just settle down to one way of working, one way of being, but it doesn't last forever, and there can be a change. And yeah, Venus is making a conjunction to Uranus, and with that Venus conjunct Uranus, it's important you take control of it. Venus conjunct Uranus can be about you creating change, or it can be about other people imposing change on you. And I think it is better that you're the one creating the change. By the way, it's not just other people imposing change on you, it just can be circumstances. And so, what would you like to change? Because if there's something you want to change, then now would be, a great time to do it. And you're going to come over today as being, a fun person, particularly, later in the day. And fun person, you'll have something to say about most subjects, and you will be in the mood for change, and you'll be able to consider change, not just sort of shy away from it. And so it can be an exciting and fun day if you have the right approach. Now, if you are completely stuck in your ways and you do not want change, and you don't want to consider the possibility of change, well, in that case, it might be a very difficult day, because you are resisting something which is quite possibly inevitable. Remember, you can't put the clock back. You can't even keep the clock still. Time is always moving. And as time moves, there are always sort of new challenges and new opportunities, and you need to move with the times. And what you don't want to do is just be stuck. Venus is moving out of Taurus, and it won't come back into Taurus until next year. And so perhaps you need to accept that. Now, one thing with Venus moving into Gemini is that it does kind of change the emphasis. Venus in Taurus perhaps was about you and how you were projecting yourself, and image might have been important. But now Venus moves into Gemini, there are other questions. The question might be, okay, so you've decided what you wanted to do. Maybe you've decided who you are, but how are you going to go about doing it? And there may be issues about your resources, or they could boil down to something horribly simple like money. And so while Venus is moving through Gemini, just don't forget the financial side of things. And you might have quite a few ideas about money with Venus moving through Gemini. Certainly two ideas, because Gemini is a double-bodied sign. There are two things going on, and so be flexible, but don't be too flexible. The trouble with Venus in Gemini is it has a certain insincerity to it, and you might want to try something and then you try something else, and that's absolutely not what you want to do. But it's a good time to be exploring financial issues, to be considering what might be the best approach, and not to be locked into any one course of action. Gemini, there is some action today. Okay, the moon does move into Scorpio, and that's one thing happening. And we also have Venus moving into your sign, and that is good news. It's great having Venus in Gemini if you are a Gemini. And with Venus in Gemini, it's a time when you're able to be yourself, and it also says something about the way you relate and how you get on with people. Over the last couple of weeks, you may have sometimes felt that it just wasn't always easy. Perhaps there was resistance. Other people were, coming up with reasons why something couldn't happen, or you yourself just felt that you just weren't in the mood. But now that Venus is in Gemini, you can be your Gemini self. You don't have to feel too self-conscious, and if you want to do something, suggest something, then probably go ahead. And you will come over as being quite an exciting and interesting person, especially as Venus in Gemini is starting to make a trine to Pluto. So that's allows you to sort of tune into your own power, and whatever it is that you want, there's a good chance you can get it, and it may be through through your charisma and your charm, or maybe your willpower. You want something and you get it, and with Venus trine Pluto, it could be relatively easy. But don't expect everything to happen at once. You know that things are moving your way. That doesn't mean to say that today, July the 4th, everything will happen. In fact, if there's something specific you want, then you might not actually get it because other people are distracted. And okay, if you're in the US, of course it's Independence Day, and people aren't really focused on sort of the mundane realities and giving Geminis what they want. But you've got the weekend, you've got next week, so don't be too impatient. And if you do find that there is something you want absolutely now, this minute, give it some more thought. It may not be quite as important, and certainly not quite as urgent as you thought it was. Cancer. At the beginning of this video, I talked about the moon in Scorpio, and I was quite negative in places about the moon in Scorpio. I was saying, the moon is at 3 degrees Scorpio. This is not a great place for the moon to be. The moon at 3 degrees Scorpio is actually the place of sort of maximum fall. But in a Cancerian chart, I don't think it really matters. I think that you're very familiar with the moon in Scorpio. It feels comfortable, and that is perhaps because the moon is in a water sign. We could be talking about strong emotions, perhaps emotions which are perhaps sometimes too strong, having to deal with other people's emotions. But as a Cancerian, it's okay. You can deal with it, even if other people can't. And the moon in Scorpio is making a trine to Jupiter. And of course, Jupiter is in your sign. Moon is making a trine to Jupiter. So really, things are moving. You feel comfortable, and additionally, with Moon trine Jupiter, you can enjoy yourself. Whatever you want to do, I think that you can do it. And if things get complicated, or if other people get complicated for whatever reason, I don't think that's going to bother you. Even though the moon is square Pluto. So moon square Pluto, again, that's another aspect I was perhaps a little negative about. But moon square Pluto is just strong feelings. That could be how it works. But where there are strong feelings, there is a possibility, Cancer, of real creativity, and that may be very important to you. So it's certainly not a light day when you should treat everything as a joke, over trivialize things. No, it's serious, but it's not too serious. And so Cancer, I do think that you are going to be able to enjoy yourself. And if you're in the United States, no reason why it can't be a great Independence Day. And aside from that, we do have Venus moving into Gemini. And so with Venus moving into Gemini, that might say something about you and other people and your attitude, and it might be a sociable day for many people. But are you going to be in the mood for socializing? Well, you're going to be quite good at socializing. You'll be very effective. You can get on with everyone. But do you want to get on with everyone? I don't think you necessarily do. I think that you're quite happy with your own company or with the company of people you know and trust. And I think that while Venus moves through Gemini over the next few weeks, there are things you might want to keep to yourself. And I don't think that you're going to want to be super sociable. I mean, I think you can be effective in a crowd, but I don't think that's necessarily where you're going to want to be. And Also, it might be that you feel there are just some things you want to keep to yourself, and if that is the way you feel, well, that is fine. But as far as today is concerned, I think that things do look good. Especially if you're in the Americas. Okay, if you're in Australia or New Zealand, then the day might have a slow start, and it might not be until the weekend that you really get into your stride. Leo, the question is, how do you want to apply yourself? I mean, you do want to apply yourself. You do want to make an impression, but is now the right time? And Leo, you could almost be quite fearful. You may be worried about the consequences of your actions. I mean, you can do it. There are many different things you can do, and you can really get noticed. But also, you're just afraid of the consequences, because you can see what might happen, and because of that, Leo, you might take the view that it's best to hold fire. Whatever the situation, whatever even the provocation, it might just not be the right time, and instead, you should maybe be thinking about what is important, what matters, and so don't feel that you have to do anything. And if you want to stay in one place, that's okay, provided that you don't brood. Some Leos might brood. They might be thinking things, feeling things, and they're not going to want to really explain it. But they know something's going on, and you might just want to hide. I mean, that's okay, but is that really what you should be doing? Is that really the right way to be using your time? I mean, it could be if you've got a purpose. It's not a day for being miserable. It's a day for finding something that you're comfortable doing, you enjoy doing. It doesn't have to be noisy. You don't have to draw attention to yourself. And if you can just quietly do something that gives you pleasure and satisfaction, then that's probably enough. And you shouldn't feel that you have to intervene. I mean, if you try to intervene, if you try to assert yourself, as I've already kind of suggested, it just might not work. And part of the reason it might not work is you don't have the confidence. We cannot be confident all the time. I mean, I know that confidence is seen as being a really good thing. Got to be confident, always got to be confident, but we can be overconfident, and perhaps it's best to accept that the situation right now is not perfect. Though one thing that is happening today is that Venus is moving into Gemini. I don't think that you're going to feel Venus moving into Gemini right now. But Venus stays in Gemini for the next few weeks, and so while Venus is moving into Gemini, while it starts to make a trine to Pluto over the weekend, that might say something about your social life, who your friends are. And so although you might feel quite isolated today, or indeed you might want to be isolated, that isn't a sign of things to come. It may actually be you just realigning to a changing situation. And in a few days' time, certainly from a social perspective, I think you'll be able to be you'll be back in the swing of things. So don't draw conclusions about today. Today is not necessarily typical, and even the weekend is not very typical. As you move into next week, things will change, and I think that things will become easier. Virgo, the moon is currently moving from Libra into Scorpio. And with the moon moving into Scorpio, you are in the mood for saying something. There are things you do want to say, especially as the moon is making a trine to Jupiter. But if you are going to say anything, be serious about it. It's not a good day for just idle chatter. Idle chatter, as far as you're concerned, might feel unsatisfactory, and as far as other people are concerned, it won't be very convincing. It'll just feel that someone is skirting around an important subject, and so it's probably best to just get to the point. And I do think that today you can get to the point, and in the process, you may be able to be quite impressive. People will like what you have to say, and maybe you can say something that other people can't say, and you can do it because of an underlying seriousness. And it is good to be serious today, and don't feel that you have to be stuck in the past. You might be, though. You might feel that you just have to rely on what was going on in the past and not think about the present or the future. Now, that would be a mistake. As far as possible, Virgo, you should try to keep things moving, and try to explore, and that will be appreciated. So maybe, in fact, Virgo, you have to move not just yourself from the past to the future, but perhaps you have to move other people from the past to the future. And maybe that's because you're able to talk about the things that matter. And once you start talking about the things that matter, you'll just know it, and you'll get a good response. And one of the main aspects taking place today is a trine between the moon and Jupiter, and this moon Jupiter trine, from a social perspective, looks to me quite fortunate. It facilitates action, and that's going to be a very much a part of who you are and who you can be. And you can go into territory that other people are afraid of, and that particularly relates to the conversation, whatever you decide you want to talk about, and might also be about where you want to go to. You might decide you want to go places that other people they're not interested. They're almost afraid. But if you decide you want to go somewhere that might be interesting, might be kind of surprising as well. That there's going to be surprises there, but you feel you need to do it. So if you do have a sudden impulse to go somewhere, then probably you should see what happens. You never know. I don't think it's going to be anything bad, and if you can create excitement for yourself and for other people, but intensity as well. It's not a trivial day. I must emphasize that it's not trivial, and you need to really concentrate on what matters. And if you can do that, then I think that you'll be in a good position, and I think that people will respect you, because you could actually end up being emotionally in control. And the reason you might be emotionally in control is because you can perhaps deal with emotions that other people don't want to touch. Libra, Venus is changing signs. It's also making a conjunction to Uranus, and if we're trying to make sense of Libra, we put a lot of emphasis on your ruler, which is Venus. And so with Venus making a conjunction to Uranus, you might feel that it's time for a change, that things have got stuck over the last few weeks, too stuck, and things just cannot continue as they have done before, and it's now time to move on. And this is something that you very much can do. And when you do make your move, it might be surprising. People might not expect it. They'd assumed that you'll act in a particular way, and you decide to do something else. And when Venus moves out of Taurus into Gemini, Venus is moving into an air sign. Of course, Libra is an air sign, and that really is a breath of fresh air. And with Venus moving into Gemini, you're finally feeling that things are moving, and that there are opportunities, of many different types. And perhaps the most important opportunity is the opportunity to discover new things, and to be looking forward rather than backwards, not to be worried about what might go wrong. Instead, to be starting to think about all those many things which are possible, and they could be possible in quite a transformative way, because actually Venus is making a trine to Pluto, as you will discover over the next few days. So overall, Libra, things are definitely improving, and it may be that there is a surprise or even a realization. With Venus conjunct Uranus, you might just realize that a load of stuff from the past which you thought was going to be a permanent part of your life is just going to go, and that things really are changing for the better. Now, we do have today a trine between the moon and Jupiter. And it's Moon in Scorpio trine Jupiter in Cancer. And the question is Moon in Scorpio a good thing? Now, Moon has fallen in Scorpio, and it's just moved out of your sign, and it's in the Via Combusta. And when you're talking about the Via Combusta, you're talking about things that are unexpected. But it's making a trine to Jupiter, and it's possible that you can actually benefit from this trine between the moon and Jupiter. It kind of depends what you're doing and how you approach it. If you take a light-hearted approach, you don't really want to delve into the details and the complications, then maybe the moon-Jupiter trine won't work, or might actually backfire, because the moon-Jupiter trine wants to be taken seriously. And you might say that Jupiter is expanding the moon. So the moon in Scorpio can be quite an intense influence. So when Jupiter's trine that moon in Scorpio, things could get out of hand. Emotions could get out of hand, particularly if they're being trivialized. On the other hand, if you take a serious approach and you regard this moon-Jupiter trine as potentially dangerous, then you might actually have an opportunity here, and that might apply to your ambitions. So it could be that you take a difficult situation, and it might not be your difficulty, it might be someone else's difficulty. You take a difficult situation, you really apply yourself to this difficult situation, and you start to make sense of it. And you start to see the opportunities, maybe financial opportunities, because the moon is in Scorpio, just left your sign, so there could be financial opportunities, but it has to be taken seriously. So, looking at the day overall, things are changing, and you can breathe. That is true, but because of that moon trine Jupiter, there are ways to benefit in extra ways, but you do have to be serious. So you don't want to be overly serious and grim and taking the view that everything is difficult, and you don't want to take the initiative because you might not know what might happen. So you don't want to be overly serious, but there is still a place for seriousness, and you have to kind of get the balance right. But being a Libra, you're very good at getting the balance right, aren't you? Scorpio. Scorpio, I see no reason why it can't be a great day. I mean, why not? I mean, the moon is moving into your sign. Some people find it difficult to have the moon in Scorpio because moon in Scorpio does have a poor reputation. The moon is fallen in Scorpio because it's exalted in Taurus. So not everyone can handle the moon moving into Scorpio, but you, as a Scorpio, you should have no problems with it, especially as the moon in Scorpio makes a trine to Jupiter in Cancer. And I think that moon Jupiter trine for you is is fortunate, and it can allow things to move very easily, very quickly, and you certainly don't have to be rooted to the spot. You can go where you want, and it might actually be a good day for exploration, for adventures. Those adventures, they don't have to be physical adventures, like doing physical things that might be dangerous, that might be risky. They can be adventures of the mind. They can be conceptual adventures, exploring new stuff. So, all of that, really is possible with this aspect. And so, what would you like to do? If you feel that there's something you absolutely want to do, then go ahead and do it. And because the moon is in Scorpio, you're going to be even more sensitive than usual. But sensitive, I think, in a good sense. You know what things are like. You know how far you can go. You have a good understanding of other people's emotions and their motivations. So that's good. If I wanted to be negative, I might say that if things have been difficult over the last couple of days, if there's anything that you have been really holding on to, bad feelings, negative thoughts, if that had been the case, if that is the case, then it is possible that when the moon makes a trine to Jupiter, it gets exaggerated, because Jupiter can exaggerate what it touches. So whatever you feel, moon makes a trine to Jupiter, you can multiply it by 2, 3, 4 times. And so it could just become excessive. So that is a possibility. Now, I'm not saying that absolutely has to happen. So, think about where you are emotionally, and think about what might happen if that got exaggerated. And that would then suggest that you just don't overdo it. We don't want things to sort of come out in sort of huge emotional lumps of energy. We don't want that. And instead it should just be, the constant application of your emotional energy. If things can be brought out into the open, but in a relatively controlled way, I think Scorpio, that would be a good thing. Now, as far as relationships are concerned, don't forget that Venus today is making a conjunction to Uranus. It's also moving into Gemini, and so Venus is doing a lot of things, and Venus is the ruler of Taurus, your opposite sign. So if you are in a close relationship with someone, watch that person. Partners need to be observed, and you need to use all your sensitivity and more, to understand what they're going through, what they're experiencing. And I'm not saying they're experiencing anything bad. They may be looking for a change, and you need to be aware of that process of change. And you mustn't make assumptions. And it's possible with Venus conjunct Uranus that you might be surprised by what another person does. It could come out of the blue. Well, it appears to come out of the blue, but in fact it had been building up for some time, and then there might be an announcement, or there could be an action which you might not be fully prepared for, but you shouldn't let it let it upset you. You know, people are just expressing their individuality, and yeah, it's very important, Scorpio, that you allow people to be individuals, because, you know, they really will appreciate that. Sagittarius. Sagittarius, it's a day when there might be some things that you do want to keep to yourself. Yeah, you know, I know, you know, if you're in the Americas, well, if you're in the United States, it's Independence Day and everything is supposed to be light and easy. I don't know. I mean, I don't really know about American holidays. I'm not an American citizen, but, you know, I know there are fireworks on July the 4th. I never quite know what people think about July the 4th. You sometimes think that fireworks are actually just an essential part of the day, which doesn't kind of make sense. And of course, it's a big argument, isn't it, in American cities, US cities, about firework regulations. And, you know, the city I'm in has very lax firework regulations, and other cities have are more strict. So of course, if you've got the laxest firework regime in the county, then everyone will converge on your city to blow things up. And of course, you don't quite know what is a firework and what is not a firework. You hear these bangs, and is it gunfire, or is it the base? Because there's a big military base nearby, and there are announcements about they were doing some demolition practice. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling, but what I'm trying to say is that, you know, with the moon in Scorpio, you might be, if you are in the United States, you might not be quite sure how to respond. You know, even though you are a Sagittarius, you know, you think that Sagittarians like fireworks, but that is not necessarily the case. It could be that fireworks bring to the surface bad memories, or you just regard them as pointless. And so, as far as the moon moving into Scorpio is concerned, you are going to appreciate your own space and your own time, and yeah, you might not want to be disturbed, and you might enjoy your own company, helped by the fact that the moon is trine Jupiter. And so this moon trine Jupiter, it can be a fortunate aspect, that's for sure, but it can only be a fortunate aspect if it's treated properly. And I think if you want to make the most of moon trine Jupiter, you probably need to have a fair amount of control over what you're doing today. You know, whether you're in the United States or you're someone else, you're not going to be on especially good form if you're, you know, surrounded by other people, if you're in a crowd. It's just, you're just going to feel that you're in the wrong place, and you do want more control. And I think that you can have that control. You just have to demand it, or just maybe it might be a good day for turning down invitations, not going places, only going to places that you just feel very good about. And you know, your own company just mustn't be underestimated. And so that probably should be, you know, your kind of day. I mean, I'd like to say that it would be more active, but I don't think you're going to want it to be active. Now, we do have a conjunction between Venus and Uranus, and Venus, having made that conjunction, moves into Gemini, your opposite sign. So although you might want to separate yourself off from other people, that may not be entirely possible, because, you know, Venus moving into Gemini might indicate that a new person is appearing on the scene. And Venus moving into Gemini, okay, it's not just a one-off event. Venus does move through Gemini for the next few weeks, and you know, while Venus is moving through Gemini, there is going to be an emphasis on the interpersonal side of things. You know, who is around, who is not around, and yes, someone new might appear on the scene. And so look out for new people. And if you're in an existing relationship with Venus moving into Gemini, there may be a change, and someone who you're with, maybe a partner, you may observe that they want things done differently, or they may be showing some versatility, and they might be looking for variety. And as a Sagittarius, that is something you're able to provide. I mean, Sagittarians are very good at creating change and experimenting with different things. Although we should never forget that Sagittarius has a particular view. Sagittarius is a sign that is ruled by Jupiter, and Jupiter can be a very moral sign. And if people want things that you regard as being unacceptable, then you're not going to provide these things. So other people are going to be very, very insistent, very clear, no, I won't say clear, because Venus is in Gemini, but they're going to have ideas. And the question is, Sagittarius, how are you going to be able to deal with those ideas? But as far as today is concerned, I would go back to what I said originally. I think it's not a day when you're going to want to be particularly sociable. I think you're going to want things done your way, and you're going to want to be in control, and you're not going to want to be crowded out. Capricorn, things look okay. The moon is making a trine to Jupiter, and this moon trine Jupiter allows you to get on with people very well in a sort of very easy way. It's all very comfortable. There's not much effort, and you don't have to try too hard. So do avail yourself of social opportunities, wherever they might be, and relationships should go to plan, and it's worth making an effort with other people. It might not be something you want to do sort of immediately, but once you start making an effort, I think that you'll soon see the benefits. And additionally, you can make people happy. It shouldn't be too difficult. And with the moon in Scorpio at the moment, I've been rather negative about the moon in Scorpio, and that might say something about some of the people they could be worried about something, they could be brooding, they could be sort of obsessed with their own feelings, but it needn't worry you. You can get through all of that. So if anyone is putting up sort of temporary barriers, or they feel unsure of themselves, they don't want to interact, then I think you'll be able to deal with the problem very, very easily. And there's something about you, Capricorn, but at the moment you can create change, and you can also be reassuring. And so don't be too self-conscious. Don't analyze things too much. Just be yourself, and be yourself in company, and you'll find that your efforts are reciprocated. And part of the problem that some people might have is that they don't know what to do. They don't know how to organize themselves, and that they just might be at a loss. And you, Capricorn, you can go some way to resolving the issue. You're going to be very good at making suggestions, and your suggestions will be listened to, and you can come up with actually concrete solutions to other people's concerns. And so you very much can be a force for good, and people will enjoy having you around. I mean, they may not be enjoying themselves to begin with, but you can actually create a situation where enjoyment is possible. But overall, I would have said it's quite sort of quiet and understated. It's not about making a big fuss or making any special effort. It's just about you being yourself, being friendly, being open, being supportive, and that's the best way of making the most of today. Aquarius. Yesterday I mentioned that the moon was getting ready to move into Scorpio, and I thought that this might be important for you. And so now the moon is in Scorpio. Okay, if you're in Australia or New Zealand, it won't be till sort of later in the day that the moon moves into Scorpio. But with the moon in Scorpio, things are changing, and perhaps your priorities are changing. Now, if you're in the United States, it's Independence Day. It's a day to relax, have fun, celebrate your country's birthday. But are you really going to be in the spirit of things? The moon in Scorpio is quite it's quite a focused position. You're thinking about maybe what you want, what you would like to achieve. You're not really worrying about just having fun in the short term. You're thinking about something more long term, and you maybe also be thinking about what your priorities might be. And because of that, it might be difficult to relax. And so with moon and Scorpio for you, it's great if you're actually doing stuff. There are things you want to get on with. Now, if you're doing nothing and you're just trying to enjoy yourself, I think it could actually be quite difficult to enjoy yourself, because moon in Scorpio is propelling you forward. And this is in spite of the fact that the moon is making a trine to Jupiter. So moon trine Jupiter, it is a great aspect. Jupiter is your ruler. Jupiter's in Cancer. Moon's in Scorpio. They're making this trine. And yeah, I think you can try to have a fun Friday, but I just don't think that you'll be very successful at it. You might even feel guilty that you should be doing something more important. But maybe at Aquarius, you need to ask yourself, well, what is important? What would you like to be doing today? What do you feel matters today? And so isolate that. And then with moon trine Jupiter, just give it everything you've got. And if you give it everything you've got, and you're very focused, and you're able to concentrate on the details that matter, then Aquarius, I think that you're going to do really well, and you might even be creating your own luck. I mean, moon trine Jupiter is quite a lucky aspect, and so if you get it right, and I think you have the opportunity to get it right, then the results could really exceed your expectations. So it's not a day to be lazy. I think you can be lazy, but just if you are lazy, you're just not going to feel very good about it. And so instead you need to think about what matters. And as far as other people are concerned, maybe you've got social expectations. You might want to enjoy other people's company, or at least you might think that's what you're supposed to do. But if you do spend a lot of time with other people in a sort of an unfocused setting, then something will be holding you back. You'll just feel that you're in the wrong place, that you're wasting your time. So any social activities that you're involved in today, you need to have a purpose for them, or else don't bother. Okay, now it's possible that you can create a purpose. So you might meet people for no particular reason, but at some stage you might see that there's a possibility here that maybe someone you meet, and it just for no real purpose, that things move in a particular direction, and maybe there's a beginning of some kind of a cooperative arrangement. So that would be fine. So that really is the picture today. It just would be a shame if you spent today with just unfocused socializing, trying to enjoy yourself, because it's just not going to be successful. I don't think. But if you decide that there is something really important and you want to give it everything, then Aquarius, I do think that you will be rewarded. Pisces, things are flowing. I mean, the moon is making a trine to Jupiter. It's also starting to make a trine to the sun. And okay, that moon trine sun isn't exact until tomorrow, until the weekend. But with moon trine Jupiter, Pisces, I think that things are really starting to move, and they're moving really very easily. And so it's a time to be enjoying yourself, and going with the flow, as every Pisces likes to do. Pisces is a water sign, and there is a fair amount of water around. Moon in Scorpio, Sun in Cancer, Jupiter in Cancer, and so don't feel any pressure. And it does matter that you do things your way. You don't have to worry too much about what other people are doing and what other people are suggesting. Don't forget, the North Node is very much in Pisces. It will be in Pisces for quite a time. And so with the North Node in Pisces, the focus should be on you, Pisces, not on the other. It is not a time for just giving in to other people's demands. And instead, with Jupiter in Cancer, in a fortunate part of your chart, what can you do, and how can you be an individual? And you can be an individual, whatever you're doing. Now, if you want to just have fun today with Moon trine Jupiter, I think that is absolutely possible, and nothing to worry about there. Additionally, we do have Venus moving into Gemini, and Venus sort of makes a conjunction to Uranus, then it moves into Gemini. And Venus moving into Gemini might say something about your own home and how you view your own home. And Venus is the planet of beauty and aesthetics. So Venus moving into Gemini, might encourage you to make changes in your home, to beautify your home, or to beautify the foundations of who you are. And of course, it's not just a home. It's the garden. It's the flowers. It's the plants around you. And Venus in Gemini, you don't really associate Venus in Gemini with nature normally, but I think in the Pisces chart you could do, and perhaps you need to have a new look at nature. And Venus in Gemini, of course, it's a double-bodied sign. On one hand, Venus in Gemini likes that variety, perhaps wants to control things in a sort of an intellectual kind of way, but at the same time, nature is nature. And you might find that nature has its own beauty, it has its own aesthetics that you don't necessarily have to alter. But the way you live is going to be important, and you're going to be quite good at perhaps making superficial changes. So if you're trying to sell property, make money out of property, Venus in Gemini maybe has the gift of the gab. Venus and Gemini can say many different things, can make things look better than they actually are. So that is one way in which Venus and Gemini could be working. Is that about today? It might not be about today. Yes, there is a change taking place, Venus moving out of Taurus into Gemini, but Venus will stay in Gemini for a few weeks. And okay, the first aspect Venus makes is a trine to Pluto. You might actually be feeling that already today, but over the weekend you'll feel that Venus trine Pluto, and perhaps with that Venus trine Pluto, you'll be starting to think about how you can change the way things look. And those are my forecasts for the 12 signs, and it's now I Ching time. So I asked the question, what is Friday going to be like for those watching the I Ching section of this video? And the first hexagram I got was hexagram number 9, the taming power of the small. So this hexagram is about restraint. The I Ching, talks about dense clouds, no rain. So we might think that something is going to happen and we might be ready to take action, but we need to have some restraint. Now might not quite be the right time, and we perhaps need to allow ourselves to be restrained, by our own common sense, or perhaps by, external events. We see things are happening or not happening, and because of this, we hold back. The time just might not be right, and don't forget what other people are saying and the advice we're being given. And we do have moving lines here, and the second line moves, and the second line moves indicates that we make some effort to make progress. We start moving in a particular direction, but it soon becomes clear that it isn't the right time, that we need to return. And it's fine, we experimented, we thought now might be the time, but it's not the right time, and so we pull back, and that's absolutely appropriate. There's absolutely nothing to worry about. Yet the third line moves as well, and the third line is a problem line, and it indicates that we might take things too far. Perhaps we didn't turn back. We should have turned back. We should have understood our limits, but we decided to just, plow on regardless. And that's when the problems start, when there could be embarrassment. And the image given is of a husband and wife looking at each other and rolling their eyes and not looking comfortable, perhaps averting each other's gaze. So that might be where the embarrassment lies. Or it could indicate something to do with a relationship. You go too far and you get a negative response. Someone might roll their eyes. They might not actually tell you that you got it wrong, but you'll know from their reaction if you have any sensitivity at all. And so best thing to do is you start something, you know when you're about to embarrass yourself, when it's about to go wrong, and you stop. And then the fifth line moves, and the fifth line, things actually start to come together here, and by holding firm to things that can be trusted, people who can be trusted. This hexagram talks a lot about neighbors and relying on one's neighbors, the people we see all the time, trusting them. And there is mutual trust. And it's because we're doing things at the right time with the right people and there is sufficient confidence, then we are able to, start to make sense of things. And I won't say make progress, because this hexagram is not about making progress. It is about holding firm. It's about consolidating. And so what you're doing is you're consolidating. Perhaps you're consolidating some of the relationships you're in, remembering that the third hexagram was really problematic. Relationships could be undermined by someone being careless, someone taking things too far. But by the fifth line, we can kind of bring things together. And we've got 3 lines moving, so we move to a second hexagram, and the hexagram we move to is hexagram number 27, which is the corners of the mouth. And with this hexagram, it says a lot about what we say. And it's the corners of the mouth. We speak with our mouth. It's sort of, there's the top lip, there's the bottom lip, and so bearing in mind the previous hexagram, the taming power of the small, a lot of the focus might be on our words and not saying too much, and being very careful about it, and also listening to what other people say. Perhaps that's where the restraint comes in. One reason to be restrained and not to be too obsessed about pushing forward with one's agenda might be because we have to give other people a chance. And by giving other people a chance, we're able to observe them. We're able to look at what they say. We are able to look at what they do. We can ask ourselves what's important to them. What are their motivations? And in that way, we can get some very valuable information. And so that's perhaps how we should see this. Corners of the mouth also says something about eating. And the previous hexagram, taming power of the small, is about taming. It's about control. Where is that control? So, if you're, in America, July the 4th, do people eat? Well, people are supposed to do all the eating on Thanksgiving, but maybe people do some eating on July the 4th as well. So even if you're not in America, think about eating. It's probably not a good idea to eat too much today, not to eat excessively. So that might just be a way of looking at the corners of the mouth. And talking about America, I think it's time to look at the United States' horoscope. I'm not going to spend a huge amount of time on America's horoscope because I do want to talk about Venus conjunct Uranus. But there are a couple of observations here. So, okay, let's start off with the chart that we know and love, the horoscope of the United States, July the 4th, 1776. A chart that I always talk about because I think it's a great chart. I think it's a chart which has so much information in it, and it really, I think, tells us so much about the United States. Solar return. So today is, the sun returns to where it was when the United States was born, and so here is the United States' solar return. I have set this for Philadelphia. That was the capital, regarded as the capital when the United States declared its independence, or around that time. And so I make that sort of around 9:51 in the evening on July the 4th. And I do think that this solar return for the United States really does matter. And it's the fact that you've got Pluto rising, you've got Mercury on the descendant, and additionally you've got Uranus on the IC. So it is a time that could be quite destabilizing the next year. This doesn't suggest a country that over the next year is going to be especially at ease with itself. And Uranus on the IC just turns things upside down, and it's not to do with, well, okay, you might think it's to do with Trump and what Trump is doing, but this solar return would have been in existence whoever won the election. You could see the solar return coming up from the moment the Declaration of Independence symbolically got signed at 5:10 p.m. on July the 4th, 1776. Of course, you wouldn't have known about Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto. You wouldn't have known about Uranus on the IC, but it was going to happen, and it was sort of fairly inevitable. And matters are made more difficult by the fact that the moon is in Scorpio, and it's square the ascendant, and the moon is conjunct true black moon Lilith. And the true black moon Lilith can be quite a malefic influence. And so the United States has a lot to deal with. And I'm not necessarily talking about the economy. There are other reasons to think that the externals of the economy might not be so bad because of this applying Jupiter-Saturn square, which Donald Trump is very familiar with. Donald Trump has an applying Jupiter. When I say applying, I mean a first quarter Jupiter-Saturn square, because you had the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction at the beginning of the 1940s. Donald Trump was born in 1946 with his Jupiter in Libra and Saturn in Cancer in mutual reception by exaltation. So Donald Trump, in a way, is kind of familiar with the current phase of the Jupiter-Saturn cycle. Now we've got Jupiter in Cancer and Saturn in Aries, but it does kind of link up with Donald Trump. So I'm not saying that the economy, at least as far as the stock market is concerned, is going to sort of collapse over the next year. I don't think it will. But it's still a country that is really uncomfortable, and that Uranus on the IC is destabilizing. Now, what is interesting about this solar return is the Sun and Jupiter. Sun is at 1319 Cancer, and Jupiter is at 545 Cancer. So let me just compare this solar return with the United States' chart. So the Sun is obviously at the same place as it was when the United States was born, but Jupiter also is. So the Sun and Jupiter in the United States' chart are what, 7.5 degrees apart, and they are 7.5 degrees apart in the US's chart. So that makes this next year really important, I think. The whole nature of that Sun-Jupiter really comes into focus, and there is this question of expansion and how far the United States goes. And we mustn't forget that Uranus is about to go into Gemini. And of course, when Uranus goes into Gemini, that tends to mean that in the past, United States finds itself at war when Uranus moves into Gemini. And of course, this might be the moment where things change. And as soon as you notice a pattern in astrology, the pattern breaks. I mean, that so often happens. But the Sun Jupiter tie-up really needs to be looked at. And so the Sun solar return is it's happening at the same time as the Jupiter return. So can you look meaningfully at a country's Jupiter return? And so just looking at a few of the United States' past Jupiter returns. So here is a Jupiter return for the United States in 1966, and this was the moment that Jupiter returned to where it was in 1776, which would have been so this took place June the 3rd, 1966, and this is quite a spectacular Jupiter return, because the Jupiter return took place at the same time as a Uranus-Pluto conjunction, and it took place at the time of a full moon. So there was a full moon in 1966, and this was conjunct. This was square the Uranus-Pluto conjunction, and this it perhaps indicates turmoil. You know, you had sort of protests, sort of the next year you had, what was it, the Summer of Love, and then you had Vietnam, and the country, of course, survived, but it was quite a turbulent time for America. And a Jupiter return theoretically lasts for 12 years, and until 1977, and it happened just after a few years after John F. Kennedy's assassination. Of course, Bobby Kennedy was assassinated 2 years later. So was Martin Luther King, and you had the height of the Vietnam War, and of course you can move forward. This also encompassed Watergate. So it was a difficult time in the United States' history, but it was not fatal. The United States survived. So we don't want to read too much into Jupiter returns. But now there is a question of the current Jupiter return. So here is a Jupiter return taking place on July the 5th. So we have the solar return on July the 4th. We have the Jupiter return July the 5th. This Jupiter return has Saturn on the IC, and it also has United States' angles. So assuming that the United States really was born at 5:10 in the afternoon, that would mean it would have 12 Sagittarius rising. And so 10 Sagittarius is pretty close to the United States' 12 Sagittarius. And so it kind of resonates with the United States' chart. And Saturn is on the IC, and we know that Saturn is crossing the United States. It's the United States' IC. It's happening, and so is Neptune. And so perhaps this Jupiter return really emphasizes that, and it gives us further support for the idea that it is going to perhaps be a difficult year. But do I regard that Jupiter return as being massively important? It's not as powerful as the 1966 Jupiter return, and so as America survived its 1966 Jupiter return, and I'm sure it will survive this Jupiter return. But I think the key point here, as I've just said, is that the solar return and the Jupiter return are happening so close together, and it is all about that relationship between the Sun and Jupiter. That the United States in its chart does have a wide Sun-Jupiter conjunction. It might be wide, but I think it matters. And so all of the connotations of Sun and Jupiter, Sun and Jupiter in the 7th, 8th house. I don't know whether to treat it as being 7th or 8th house. I'd say the Sun was in the 8th. I would say the USA has the Sun in the 7th and Jupiter in the 8th. But of course, from a whole sign perspective, it has its 8th house. And because it's Jupiter, there is a question about how the United States expands, where it moves forward to. And also, there is a moral side to it. Jupiter in Cancer, there is a morality not just about itself, but also about other countries. This is perhaps one of the reasons why the United States has been so into regime change, wanting to change regimes, because it has ideas about how best other people should run their countries, and so that could be how Jupiter works. But we'll see. But I think it is about something going too far, and I do think that the next year for the United States is going to be turbulent. You don't have to be an astrologer to say that, but I think that the prime concern, perhaps from a non-American perspective, is what does the United States get involved in, given the fact that Uranus is moving into Gemini. And I will be talking about Uranus in Gemini in some detail in a few days' time, because I think it's on Monday that Uranus changes sign. And now I want to shift to Venus conjunct Uranus. This is an aspect that is happening today. There's the aspect. I make it that it takes place 1:45 p.m. in London time, and so there's Venus Uranus, there's a Venus Uranus conjunction at 29:52. So this conjunction takes place just before Venus moves into Gemini, and so what does it mean? Venus Uranus potentially is a destabilizing influence, and it's looking for variety. And if we look at it from a natal perspective, one thinks of, well, Venus, relationships, Venus conjunct Uranus, unstable relationships changing, new relationships coming in, old relationships going, people changing their mind. And additionally, Venus, you can connect Venus with art and particular ideas about what looks good. It doesn't look good to everyone. So that's something to think about. Venus is also a universal planet of women. And with Venus conjunct Uranus, it may put the focus on women in the public eye, or what is happening to women, or government policy towards women. So that's a way of looking at it. And we should remember that Venus conjunct Uranus isn't just affecting the United States, it's affecting every country in the world. And so if you're in Afghanistan, that Venus conjunct Uranus is going to be just as relevant as if you're in the US. And I do think that it makes today sort of interesting, and there is potentially a certain rebelliousness in the air. Now, I just want to look at a few people who have Venus conjunct Uranus. I haven't got very many people who have Venus conjunct Uranus. And then I just want to look at some Venus-Uranus events. So looking at a couple of people who have Venus conjunct Uranus, one of them is Jesse Livermore. Jesse Livermore, I do find him really interesting. Jesse Livermore was one of the most sort of successful private investors ever. He was born in 1877, and he made huge amounts of money on the stock market, and he lost a huge amounts of money on the stock market. And so his life was a pattern of making a lot of money, bankrupt, making a lot of money, bankrupt. And he just went through this pattern throughout his life, and he just couldn't help himself. Even with the Wall Street crash in 1929, he came home that day and he made a fortune. He made a fortune during the Wall Street crash in 29, but then he lost it, and a few years later he was bankrupt, and then in the end he couldn't make it back, perhaps because the Roosevelt regime, when FDR became president in 1933, maybe the rules would change, they were tightened up, and it wasn't so easy for someone like Jesse Livermore to make money out of nothing. And in the end, he committed suicide in 1940, having been bankrupt. And so he had Venus conjunct Uranus. So Jesse Livermore, there's his Venus-Uranus conjunction in Leo. And so in his case, okay, Venus might say something about relationships, but Venus is a planet of money, and Venus and Uranus, rapid changes in financial fortune, and it's also in a fixed sign. He wasn't able to stop, so he would make more money than he could possibly have needed. I mean, I think in modern money he was a billionaire almost as a result of speculating on the Wall Street crash and going short as well as long. But still, he couldn't help himself. He didn't just say, "I've made my money, that's great." He just carried on, and this was the pattern. He just kept going until he was bankrupt. Then he'd start again until he couldn't start again anymore, and then he shot himself. So that's one way in which Venus-Uranus conjunction could work. And someone rather different, Venus-Uranus can have an unpleasant side to it, and that is Mohammed Atta, one of the leader of the attack on the World Trade Center, and he had Venus conjunct Uranus. And so Venus conjunct Uranus might simply describe someone who just leads a mission to fly a plane into the World Trade Center. If you take Uranus as an explosive force and Venus just as a personal planet. Now, Venus might also say something about women, and Venus conjunct Uranus, he had issues with women. I think he studied in Germany and he was awarded some diploma in architecture, and he was supposed to get this diploma from this female in charge of the college or whoever was giving out the diplomas, and he wouldn't shake her hand. So he had issues with women because he didn't want any physical contact with a woman, I think, which is, of course, from a Western perspective, that sounds strange, but that might explain Venus conjunct Uranus. And he was an architect student. And so Venus is about aesthetics and what things look like. And he apparently had some really good ideas. He had a traditional approach and he wasn't into sort of modern stuff. And he had ideas about what kind of buildings you might want to have in Cairo. And maybe if he hadn't got involved in extreme Islam and terrorism, he could have been a very good architect, and that might be related to his Venus conjunct Uranus in Virgo, because there's something quite traditional about the sign Virgo. And Nancy Pelosi has got Venus conjunct Uranus, and she's got Venus conjunct Uranus quite close to her midheaven, and she's not going away. She's still there. And Venus is not a planet that is going to be projected because it's hers. It's a female planet, and Venus conjunct Uranus might be about her, wanting perhaps to make an impression. And I don't know a great deal about her. Venus conjunct Uranus is in Taurus, so maybe it's not as crazy and unstable as it would be as if it was in say Gemini or Sagittarius, but anyway, she does have Venus conjunct Uranus, and when you've got Venus conjunct Uranus, you can be at the center of dramatic events. The president, the Ngo Dinh Diem, who was president of South Vietnam, he had Venus conjunct Uranus. So Venus at 13 Sagittarius, Uranus at 14 Sagittarius, and so with that Venus-Uranus conjunction, he wanted to make changes in South Vietnam. He had particular views about the way things should be. And in Sagittarius, now so Sagittarius is a sign ruled by Jupiter. There is a religiousness to Sagittarius, potentially, and he was a Catholic, and he was sort of infamous for making moves against the Buddhist population in South Vietnam, and of course you had that. What destroyed his presidency was when that in 1963 when that Buddhist monk immolated himself in Saigon, and it was just this sort of image of this monk burning, and he couldn't survive, and after that, and there was a coup, and he was supported by the CIA, and he was killed in that coup, and so he may be an example of someone using Venus and Uranus, or manifesting Venus conjunct Uranus, not necessarily in a very positive way, and it might also say something about what he's attracting. Mars making a square to Venus, square to Uranus. And maybe he just didn't have the sensitivity to see what was going on. And I always like to make a comparison between Ngo Dinh Diem's chart and that of Vladimir Zelensky, who is in a kind of a similar position to Ngo Dinh Diem, likewise persecuting, perhaps being the sort of the Orthodox Church in Ukraine, so there is a link there, and someone who, like Ngo Dinh Diem, trying to be different, getting support from America. So Venus conjunct Uranus, and Venus conjunct Uranus. Well, Venus was actually conjunct Uranus when Zelensky was inaugurated. So Zelensky has a Sun-Venus conjunction at 5 Aquarius, and there was a Venus-Uranus conjunction, 4 degrees Taurus, between 4 and 6 degrees Taurus at the time when he became president. And so that Venus-Uranus conjunction does say something about his presidency. And it is a presidency that brings about a huge amount of change. And Venus is in Taurus is about maybe being quite stubborn. And Zelensky is very stubborn, and that's perhaps his great strength and his great weakness, having a Sun-Venus conjunction in Aquarius. And so Venus-Uranus conjunction might indeed say something about Zelensky's presidency. But Venus-Uranus conjunction can also be about the collective. So here's a chart of the Challenger Collective. Now let me explain what I mean by the Challenger Collective. So in 1986 you had the Challenger disaster, and this is of course when the space shuttle exploded. And so what I did with the Challenger Collective is I took all of the charts of all of the astronauts on board the Challenger and I averaged them all out. So I took the average Sun, average Moon, average Mercury, and I came up they had an average birth date of May the 14th, 1946. And if you take that average chart, they have a Venus-Uranus conjunction, and Venus-Uranus conjunction may just be symbolic of just things happening, even though it's trine Jupiter. So there's the excitement of Jupiter in Libra. Remember, it's the summer of 1946. It's their average birth date, and so Venus conjunct Uranus can just be an explosion, and it may be as simple as that. Now we don't see traditionally Venus-Uranus conjunctions as being about explosions, but it's just Uranus, personal planet, something explosive, and it's in the public eye. And with other events, talking about revolution. So when Venus is conjunct Uranus, people are restless. And the surrender of the Bastille, July the 14th, 1789, took place at the time of a Venus-Uranus conjunction. So you could say that the Venus-Uranus conjunction is sort of baked into the French horoscope, if you take the fall of the Bastille as being a symbolic time for the beginning of France. So, but Venus conjunct Uranus, people are restless. Uranus is the planet of revolution, and so when you've got Venus-Uranus conjunctions, you need to look about what the people are doing. Are people restless? Do they want revolutions? Do they want to overthrow something? And then there's a question, should you get married when Venus is conjunct Uranus? Probably not. Venus is can be a planet of relationships. And so, getting married on a Venus-Uranus conjunction, things can happen, and maybe quite bad things can happen. So here is the chart of the marriage of Gabriella Windsor. I mean, she's some royal. I don't know anything about her, but she's some royal who got married in 2019, and a few years later, the man she married shot himself, and I don't know why, but at the time of this wedding, Venus was, Venus very nice in Taurus in its own sign, but it was conjunct Uranus. And so, very simply, Venus conjunct Uranus might just be something happening, and something happening which may not always be positive. You could make the mistake of saying, oh, you should have Venus conjunct Uranus in a wedding chart because it's exciting. But there is a view that Uranus is a malefic. And so having Venus conjunct a malefic is not something you want. And a wedding, you want the marriage to be stable. You want it to last. You don't want it ending early because of divorce or because the man kills himself. So that's perhaps why we should maybe avoid having conjunctions between Venus and Uranus when we create elections, if we're trying to choose a time to get married or set up a business, for example. Now, Venus is a planet which is, it's connected with rebellion. We looked at the fall of the Bastille, and another example of a rebellion taking place when there was a Venus conjunct Uranus was the Whiskey Rebellion. So the Whiskey Rebellion was a rebellion which took place at the beginning of the United States. I think it was about tax on whiskey, and the American Revolution might have been all about escaping tax from Britain. No tax without representation. But then, having got its independence, the new United States wanted to do its own taxing, and it wanted to tax whiskey, and as a result there was a rebellion by, I think, whiskey producers I set this at Bower Hill, Pennsylvania. And this rebellion started with Venus, as Venus started to make a conjunction to Uranus. I mean, it didn't get very far, and I think George Washington was president. I mean, it wasn't put down with great violence, but it wasn't a threat to the Republic or anything like that. But it was still a rebellion, and it demonstrated that the new government, wanted to be in control and wanted to raise money. Someone's got to raise money, and just because you've lost the British doesn't mean to say that taxation has ended. I think it's actually true to say that after independence, taxes were higher in the colonies, or in the former colonies, than they were under the British. But anyway, that's another matter. I'm not an expert on 18th century American history. And so Venus conjunct Uranus with rebellions. Another rebellion that took place with Venus conjunct Uranus was the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. So not to be confused with the Warsaw Uprising in 1944, which was sort of a general uprising just as the Russians were close to Warsaw. But the 1943 Ghetto Uprising was when the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto, they realized that what was going to happen to them, and they thought they might as well rebel because they had nothing to lose. And this took place on April 19th, 1943. And Venus was making a conjunction to Uranus, so that sort of fits the rebellion theme. So we've got the Ghetto Uprising, the Whiskey Rebellion, and the fall of the Bastille. So there does seem to be a theme there. Now, on the same day as the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, something happened in Switzerland, which is a very different event. And so in Switzerland the same day, on April 19th, 1943, in Basel, this was the first time that someone deliberately took LSD, when Albert Hoffman took LSD deliberately to see what would happen. He actually had taken it 3 days earlier by mistake. He had his famous bicycle ride where he accidentally exposed himself to LSD, and then he cycled home, and then he started tripping, and then. But that also is a Venus-Uranus event. How well? It's certainly surprising. Certainly, the original accidental exposure to LSD on the 16th was an event that really wasn't planned for, but it happened, and it changed everything. It was quite revolutionary in its own way. And other sort of negative event. Remember when last year when the Iranian president got killed in a helicopter crash? There's Venus and Uranus sort of around 1 degree apart, and when the WHO officially declared COVID as a pandemic, Venus was conjunct Uranus. By the way, as far as orb is concerned, all these conjunctions between Venus and Uranus, I've gone for a 3-degree orb. I've not gone for any higher. So I've gone for tight orbs. And finally, Venus is a planet of women. And so when you've got Venus conjunct Uranus, it is possible that there might be events relating to a woman. And one event that took place when Venus was conjunct Uranus was the assassination of Indira Gandhi. So Indira Gandhi was the Indian Prime Minister, and she was assassinated by her bodyguard. And there was a conjunction between Venus and Uranus. I think that the ascendant was at 15 degrees Sagittarius. So just before the assassination, as her bodyguard were preparing to kill her, because it was a Sikh bodyguard, and it was all about independence for Punjab, and also there'd been a raid on the Golden Temple in Amritsar, and this was something that the Sikhs were upset about, and this was sort of the background to her assassination. But although the Venus-Uranus conjunction was separating, as this conjunction rose was the moment when she was assassinated, and you see true Black Moon Lilith also moving on the IC. So yeah, that could be it. Uranus, sudden event, Venus involving a woman. This was a female. The female prime minister. So those are a few thoughts on the USA, and those are a few thoughts also on Venus conjunct Uranus. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did enjoy this video, I'd be very grateful if you were to like it. If you're not subscribed, I'd be super grateful if you were to subscribe. If you want to buy me a coffee, there's a link in the description, and I will talk to you again tomorrow.